how do we know that Darwin wasn't off his rocker and that this theory actually makes some sense? Because really it has stood the test of time for 150 years as a theory, and it seems like our best bet, and it really does make some sense. So let's talk about why it makes some sense. The first idea is this idea of biogeography. And if you break apart the word biogeography and you take a look at it, there are a couple pieces to it. You've got the word bio, and we know that bio refers to life, anything that's alive. And then you've got geography, and we know that geography is Earth, so it's maps of the Earth. So where do things live on Earth? So biogeography is where things live on Earth, where organisms live, and then also where did their ancestors live? So where did these organisms live before? There are two pieces to biogeography. The first is that Darwin noticed that there were organisms that were really closely related to each other, but they lived in very different environments, and they showed very great differences. So if we look over at the different finches, these finches all lived on different Galapagos Islands. Pardon me while I get my ink all together here. So in the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of South America, there were these different finches on different islands. Now, Darwin originally thought that these were all different birds. He didn't realize that they were all finches. It wasn't until he collected them and got back to England and he showed them to one of his friends, and his friend said, "Hey, man, those are all finches." And he said, "No, these are all very different birds. I mean, look at them. There's no way that you can tell me that this guy and, and this guy are the same bird." So the original one I meant to circle is this one. So there's no way you can tell me that these two are the same bird. Well, in fact, they are. They're both finches. They're just different kinds of finches, and they're finches that live on different islands. So if you look at this diagram, you can kind of see that these four finches are what we call ground finches. This one right here is the cactus finch because it's a cactus eater. These three over here are seed eaters. So they have beaks that are very specifically created for crushing seeds. This warbler finch has a probing beak, and it's going to be good for eating insects. And these grasping beaks over here on the small tree finch and the large tree finch, those are good for eating insects. And then this vegetarian tree finch over here has a beak that's very good for eating fruit. So these different finches lived in very different environments, and so they needed to have different kinds of beaks. If you live someplace where there are lots of insects, you need a beak that's going to let you eat. So in other words, you need a beak that's going to let you eat insects. If you live in a place where there are lots of seeds, you need a beak that's going to let you eat lots of seeds. You can't use this beak to eat insects because a crushing beak isn't going to let you pick up an insect like you need to in order to be able to eat it. So even though they were very closely related, they were all finches, they were very different in some pretty main ways. So that's this idea that life forms living in different places have these different ways of having evolved. The other idea behind biogeography works kind of the opposite way. And what Darwin saw was that he had organisms that lived in similar environments, and they had very similar characteristics, but they were very distantly related. So if we look at pumas that are found in the Americas or cheetahs that are found in Africa, we would look at those and we'd say, oh, those are very similar. They're both big cats. They're both very furry. They both have these ears that are very similar. They've got these big paws. They live in kind of similar environments, kind of arid, maybe sort of dry. They've got to get their water not readily available to them all the time. But they're not closely related. So if we go back in their family tree, we have to go back quite far before we find a common ancestor for them. Even though we have to go back quite far, they've evolved in very similar ways because their environments are so similar. All right, after biogeography, Darwin started to look at body structures. And what he said was that organisms with similar structures must be related in some way. Now, that could be related in a recent common ancestor or related in terms of how they've evolved. So there are three different kinds of body structures that we can talk about. We can talk about homologous traits, we can talk about analogous traits, and we can talk about vestigial traits. So homologous traits, analogous traits, and vestigial traits. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about all three of these. Homologous traits, and homo means same. Homologous traits are traits that are inherited from a common ancestor. So you have certain traits that your grandma has, and you and your brothers and sisters have, or you and your cousins have. Those are homologous traits. You know where you got them from this common ancestor. So if we look at this Eusthenopteron, which is a common ancestor to the frog, the rabbit, the lizard, and the bird, we're not saying that the Eusthenopteron became a frog, and then the frog became a rabbit, and then the rabbit became a lizard, and then the lizard became a bird. We're saying that the Eusthenopteron became something, and that something else became something else, and those something else's became something else, and those something else's became something else, and ultimately, after those branched off enough times, we ended up with a frog. Okay, and then as the Eusthenopteron branched off again, those ancestors, they branched off and off and off and off and off and off, and ultimately we ended up with a rabbit. So all of this branching off happened over and over and over and over and over and over and over again to give us these different organisms. And what we see at the ends of all of these branches is that the frog, the rabbit, the lizard, and the bird all have this same 3-bone sequence that the Eusthenopteron had. So the frog has a radius, this red bone. It has an ulna, this brown bone, and it has a humerus, which is this yellow bone. So we see this combination of radius and ulna right next to each other, with the humerus being in this upper arm or sort of forelimb bone. Then the rabbit has the same thing. Here's the radius and an ulna right next to each other, with a humerus attached up at the top. Radius, ulna, humerus. Radius, ulna, humerus. All 4 of these organisms that currently exist on Earth all have a radius, an ulna, and a humerus. And you know what else has a radius, an ulna, and a humerus? You do. Your forearm, the lower part of your arm, has a radius and an ulna, and your upper arm has a bone called a humerus. So we all share this common ancestor, but we have to go all the way back to this Eusthenopteron. Now again, I'm not saying humans evolved from birds or that birds evolved from humans. I'm saying we share a common ancestor. So homologous traits are traits that came down from that common ancestor. They may have changed, they may have stretched out a bit. So if you look at this rabbit's limb bones, they are definitely way longer than the ones in the Eusthenopteron. But it's still that same very, very similar structure. Alternatively, there are analogous traits. And analogous traits are traits that are very similar, but they did not come from a common ancestor. Analogous traits evolved separately on their own. Analogous traits evolved separately on their own. And they evolved separately due to similar environmental pressures. So analogous traits come from similar environmental pressures, not from a common ancestor. So in this example, we're going to look just at the purple here, because if we look at the green and the yellow and the orange, we're going to get confused. The green, the yellow, and the orange all show homologous traits, and that's not what we're talking about on this slide. We're talking about the purple part. So all 4 of these organisms, which are, this insect, this butterfly kind of thing, what appears to be a pterodactyl, a sort of bird wing, and a bat wing. These are all wings. Wings are analogous structures. All of these organisms developed wings because flying was something that benefited them. Flying was something that made them fit for their environments. So organisms that had wings in those populations survived, and they made babies, and so there were more organisms that had wings. So these are things, this analogous traits are things that develop because they're beneficial, but they're separate from each other. They don't come from a common ancestor. And then lastly, there are vestigial traits. Vestigial traits are my favorite, I think, just because I like saying the word vestigial. But vestigial traits are traits that were useful to an ancestor, but they're no longer needed by the existing organism. So whatever organism we're looking at in our day and age right now, they have these traits that they don't need anymore. They're not using them. So many of us don't know that whales actually have hind limb bones. So if you could look inside a whale, if you could x-ray a whale, you would see these little hind limb bones where you would think that they're going to have these little back legs. But we all know that whales don't have back legs. So why do they have these bones here? Well, the reason they have these bones here is that, in fact, the latest theory thinks that whales and wolves share a common ancestor. And so whales and wolves at some point had a common ancestor that had these hind limbs. Wolves obviously held on to their hind limbs as they evolved. Whales didn't need them. So what they think is that there was this common ancestor. Bear with me, I'm writing with my mouse here, so this isn't going to be so beautiful. But there was this common ancestor, and at some point, this common ancestor realized that there was food on land, but there was also food in water. And so the population split off, and some of the population went to live in the water, and some of the population went to live in the land. And so the population that went to live in the water went and lived and did well and was fine. And the population that went to live on land also did fine. But then these populations split off, and these populations split off. And then again, the splitting off happened over and over and over and over and over again. And sometimes they split off in 2s and 3s and 4s, any number of splitting off. And some of those organisms survived and some of those organisms died. And so down the way, 1,000,000,000,000,000 times, okay, maybe not 1,000,000,000,000,000, that's a lot. We get to where over here we have wolves, and then these guys branched off 1,000,000,000,000,000 times. Okay, again, not 1,000,000,000,000,000, but these guys branched off a bunch of times, and one of those became what we now know as whales. So once again, we're not saying that wolves came from whales. We're not saying that whales came from wolves. We're saying that wolves and whales share a common ancestor. So if we go way back in the family tree of wolves and whales, we'll find this organism here that is an ancestor to both of them. Okay, then we go into embryology. This is really, really cool to me because if you look at this picture, these are embryos of several different species. Embryos are newly developing organisms. So we know that sperm meets egg, and when sperm meets egg, there's a little bit of electricity, and then that one cell becomes 2 cells, 2 cells become 4 cells, 4 cells become 8 cells, 8 becomes 16. We've been over this and over this and over this. And pretty soon you're going to get this zygote, and the zygote is going to start to develop, and when the zygote develops a little further, you're going to get an embryo. So an embryo is this new being, still very, 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 very new, inside the womb, nowhere near to being born. And born isn't even a really good word because some of these right here are reptiles. So in these pictures, one of these is a human embryo, one of them is a salamander embryo. One's a turtle, one's a cow, one's a pig. We have all kinds of different embryos happening here, but look at how similar they are. If we go a little bit further in development and we let these embryos develop a little while longer, we can start to see some differences. So we can start to see some things that look a little bit like gills forming here. We can see a little bit more of a tail forming here, whereas the tail is sort of kind of starting to recede here. Got a little bit of a belly happening here. So we've got some different things going on. As we look a little bit more at this development, we can start to see some clear differences. Here's a shell. That's probably not our human. We can be pretty sure that's not our human. That's probably our tortoise or our turtle. This looks very clearly like a fish. So we can definitely see some differences here. But look at these 3 guys over here. Look at how similar these 3 guys look. When you start to really nitpick and take a look, you can see some differences. Like you can see the longer tail here. You can see a little bit of a tail here, and you can see no tail here. You can see a little curly Q of a tail here and kind of a little snout here. But just kind of stand back and look at how similar those are. So in fact, this column all shows the development of a fish. This column all shows the development of a salamander. Here's our tortoise. This is a chicken. You can see its little beak here. This is the development of a pig. And it's the cow, the rabbit, and the human that all looked incredibly similar to each other, even at this later stage in embryological development. What that says to us is that the development of these organisms is happening along the same path. We're all following the same rules as we develop. Well, how could we all be following the same rules unless we developed those rules together? So, according to the theory of evolution, there was this way common ancestor that said, here's how we develop. And then as we split off into those branches, we changed the later stages of that development. But the early stages have all stayed the same. Fossils are another great way to look at evolution and why we think evolution is a pretty valid theory. And fossils are our best bet at really visualizing what's happened. So you guys probably already know that fossils are the preserved remains of ancient organisms. And what's important here is that they showed us transitional forms. So transition means going from one thing to another thing. So we perform a transition when we go from one thing to another thing. So here's a transitional form from something called Pakicetus. And Pakicetus lived 50 million years ago. And we currently have a thing now called the beluga whale. And you've probably all seen pictures of beluga whale at some point. We know that the beluga whale that lives in our oceans now has these nostrils at the top of its skull. And the nostrils at the top of the skull are very useful because it allows the whale to stay mainly underwater. So all of this part of the whale can stay underwater and still breathe. Well, Pakicetus 50 million years ago had nostrils that were here. Well, that wasn't the most useful thing in the world. It worked for them. They were great. But as of 25 million years ago, we had this organism called Embryology, and we found fossils of this organism. And the fossils of that organism show nostrils in the middle of the skull. So over generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, there were these changes. So Pakicetus had some babies, and some of those babies had nostrils that were a little bit far back. They probably got teased by all the other Pakicetuses, and all the other Pakicetuses said, ha ha, look at you, your nostrils are way back up on your head. Probably called them names and made fun. But what happened is that those Pakicetuses survived because they could breathe better. So they lived. They made babies. Those babies then, at some point, accidentally, some mutation caused them to have nostrils that were further back on their skull. Those guys survived, had babies, got us back to Embryology that then had these nostrils toward the middle of the skull. Millions of years go by more, 25 million more years, and nostrils moved back and back and back and back, little by little by little, until we get to where our beluga whale is now that has nostrils at the top of the skull. And this is really useful for them. Another example here is the feet of horse and horse ancestors. So 55 million years ago, there was this Hyracotherium that had these 4 toes. Well, the 4 toes were all well and good, but they weren't really necessary. And so we see that different organisms branched off having these 4 toes. But at a certain point, somebody lost a toe. Something happened genetically that made them not grow that 4th toe. And in fact, made them grow so that they had 1 big middle toe and 2 smaller side toes. And that worked really well for them. They lived, they survived, they made babies. Everybody else went off and died off. So these guys survived and made their babies. And some more evolution happened. Many million years went by. Some of these guys went off. Who knows? Maybe they had 6 toes. Maybe they had no toes. You know, who knows what was going on with these guys. But then we get to Parahippus. Parahippus did really well. Parahippus really had 1 really big mega toe. And then these 2 little weird, sad side tripod toes. And that was okay for them for several million years ago. And then we made it to 4 million years ago. And 4 million years ago, they said, you know what? Those side toes, those are overrated. We don't need those anymore. We just need this 1 center toe. And so this is the ancestor of our current horse hoof. So if you look at a horse's foot, a horse doesn't have toes. There's this hoof down at the bottom of the leg. And that's where this came from, is the loss of toes over millions and millions and millions of years. That was advantageous. But because we've dug up bones and we've dated all these bones to find out how old they are, we can see this transition happen. DNA and molecular biology. And this is an area where we're lucky because Darwin didn't know about this stuff. This is evidence Darwin didn't have. Remember that Darwin was doing his work in the first third of the 1800s. We didn't know about DNA for sure, until the 1950s. So DNA and molecular biology didn't come about for another 100 years after Darwin. Darwin didn't have a clue about any of this, but we do. What we've discovered, and really just in the last 10 to 15 years in your lifetimes, is that DNA is really similar in closely related species. So we can go back and look at similarities in DNA. We can look at those A's, G's, C's, and T's and what order they're in. And we can see how closely related two organisms are. There are some molecules that are found in nearly all living things. For example, there's this molecule called cytochrome C. And cytochrome C is necessary for cellular respiration. And almost all organisms on Earth do cellular respiration. And guess what? Almost all organisms on Earth have cytochrome C. So probably that first organism, that first thing that was living in that primordial ooze, that organism made cytochrome C accidentally one day, and it worked really well. And so then when it went on to have babies, all of its babies had cytochrome C, and then all of their babies had cytochrome C, and then all of their babies had cytochrome C, all the way up to us having cytochrome C and bananas having cytochrome C. Speaking of bananas, when we look at molecular biology, I've told you guys that if you go far enough back, you're related to a banana. In fact, looking at your DNA is 50% the same as a banana. You and a banana have 50% the same DNA. Even more incredible is that you and a chimpanzee have 98%. Actually, I think it's 98.8% of the same DNA. So if we took those A's, G's, C's, and T's, yours and a chimp's, 98% of them would match up. Now, that does not mean that you evolved from a chimp. That does not mean that chimps evolved from us. Humans and chimps shared a common ancestor. So at no point do chimps and humans evolve one from another. We're saying they shared a common ancestor. And one way we can look at that is to look at all the similar DNA. We can look at you and a brother or sister and see a lot of really similar DNA because you got it from the same parents. The same thing is true, but we're talking about whole species now instead of just individuals. So if we look at whole species DNA, we can tell what's really closely related and what's not really closely related. And DNA helps us see that we're very closely related to chimpanzees. If you go a little bit further back, we're 90% the same as cats. Humans and cats have 90% of the same DNA. Interestingly enough, humans and cows have 80% the same DNA. So we're actually more genetically close to cats than we are to cows, which I thought was kind of interesting. Fruit flies, those tiny little annoying flies that fly around your kitchen if you let fruit go bad, we are 60% the same as a fruit fly. 60% of our DNA is the same as a fruit fly. So we're really not as different as we think we are. Evolution is a theory that shows that really there is some sense here, that we all started out with this one common ancestor and then branched off. Now there have been millions and 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 millions of branches to this tree of life. But they are branches and they do all ultimately lead back. And so this theory of evolution holds up because of things like theories or pieces of evidence like biogeography and fossils and embryology and homologous traits and analogous traits and vestigial traits and our DNA and molecular biology.